There were so many things I needed to learn about you all in the search process. One of the first things that I learned about UUCP, though, was our history. It was in the packet right up at the top at the ministerial search committee put together for all of the candidates. It was in the beautiful website that they created. And it was here for candidating week. Charlotte gave me a whole booklet with photos with a detailed account of our history. I thank you, Charlotte, and I thank Gretchen Manker before her for being such faithful stewards of our history. It's important to know where we came from. Our history is important because it also contains threads of who we are now. And embedded into our history are elements that are woven into our DNA as a community. And my dear ones at UUCP, our history is filled with resilience. Now, Katie Resendez and I took a little bit of liberty with our together time this morning, but not much. I want to give that history and context of where our congregation has lived again, for all of us here, but also for the growing number of people who are watching this sermon online. We are up to as many as 55 people a week watching our services online now. Okay, so we're going to pretend that we're a time machine and going back about 15 minutes ago. Okay, ready? Here's the story. Isabel Johnson, yes, the Johnson of the Johnson Room, put an ad for a Unitarian church, calling it a fellowship of free minds and the creative spirit in 1947. They were meeting at the Kenilworth School on 5th Avenue between Moreland and Culver. The worship services were held in the school auditorium, and the children's programs were held in the playground. The kindergartners in the sandbox, the first and second graders on the steps of the fire escape, the third and fourth graders on the baseball bleachers. I was not making that part up. In 1949, the school board asked the congregation to leave. So they moved to the Valley Garden Center in Encanto Park. The worship was in a big community room, and the children's classes were down the block at the nursery school. They were there from December of 1949 and the full program year of 1950. But then permission to use the premises was abruptly withdrawn. So they went to the YWCA. The worship was in a big auditorium, and the kids were in the unfinished basement. Only 3 months later, they were asked to leave. Now, all three of these moves were due to being asked to leave, and there is a common thread to all of them that we'll get to in a minute. But there are 3 more moves that we have yet to discuss. So realizing that any location may ask them to leave and knowing that they were in a tenuous situation, the congregation leased land from a member and built their own building in 45 days for $1,500. They worked every Saturday and Sunday, taking that break at 11 a.m. for a quick worship, sitting on planks supported by bricks, wearing their work clothes. I love the story of one member in a carpenter's hat and canvas work gloves who remarked that it had been a long time since she had worn a hat and gloves to church. That sounds like our people, right? That was our first 10 years. By that point, we had grown too big for that home-built space, so we moved to the Phoenix Jewish Community Center while we made plans for a more permanent home. Worship was in their auditorium, and we kept growing, so it moved into the gym. And can you imagine, the children's programming was still back in that old building that had to be built. Parents would drop their kids off at the old building, go to the Jewish Center about 10 blocks away, then go back and pick up their kids after the service. And that leads us to our location here. Under the leadership of the Reverend Arthur Olson, the congregation purchased the 10 acres here on Lincoln Avenue, which at that time wasn't even a through street. Francis Bishop, a member at the time, recalls it this way: "After we purchased the property, we gave directions so that members could go out and view their new purchase. He said, go to Tatum Boulevard, to Lincoln Drive, turn west, and when the road ends, walk to the 4th telephone pole." That's the eastern boundary of our church. We finally moved into this building in 1961. For those of you who needed a calculator to calculate that, like I did. I literally pulled out my calculator. It was 58 years ago. And I know this also because our building is so 58 years old. And just ask the big new hole that's on our roof that's really gonna need to be addressed. But again, I digress. 1961 was just 14 years after our founding. We were barely a teenager of a congregation, and we had already moved 6 times. And by the way, we had also already had 7 ministers. That is slightly related to this story, but also very different, and tons of material for a whole new sermon. So I'm going to hold on to that one. The title of this sermon is From Communism to Community. So you may be wondering where this communism ties in. Well, it's important to put our timeline that we're talking about solidly in history. We were smack in the middle of the McCarthy era. So let's have a little history lesson here. 1947, the same year we were founded, President Truman signed an executive order to screen federal employees for association with organizations deemed totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. McCarthyism became the term for the practice of making accusations of subversion or treason without any regard to evidence. The McCarthy era was named after Senator Joseph McCarthy, who I'm still so sad that he's got such a legacy with his name, honestly, who in 1950, he presented an alleged list of members of the Communist Party working in the State Department. This became a widespread movement to attack political adversaries of any kind. The term has generally been expanded to describe reckless, unsubstantiated accusations and demagogic attacks on the character of patriotism or political adversaries. Let's just think about that again. Reckless, unsubstantiated accusations or demagogic attacks on the character or patriotism of political adversaries. Maybe we're not talking about such long ago history after all, are we? So during the McCarthy era, hundreds of Americans, usually those of the political left, were accused of being communists or communist sympathizers. They became the subject of aggressive investigations and questionings before government or private industry panels, committees, or agencies. Suspicions were often given credence despite inconclusive or questionable evidence. And the level of threat posed by a person's real or supposed leftist associations or belief were sometimes greatly exaggerated. Many people suffered loss of employment or destruction of their careers. Some were imprisoned. And there was a common element that many of those who were accused had. They were the liberal, countercultural thinkers who challenged the status quo. Some of them may have been communists. I'm pretty sure that most of them weren't, but it didn't matter. They were the radical thinkers at the time, and people had been convinced that they were to be feared and that they were dangerous. So let's go back to our UUCP story. The troubles began when UUCP's second minister, Reverend John Finley, signed a letter to President Truman protesting U.S. intervention in Korea. So those pesky ministers who sign letters and say what they're meaning, it just happened to be that other signers of that letters were broadly known to be communists. And Finley became associated with them because he signed the same letter. And before you know it, this little congregation became embroiled in the McCarthy era. This was a real problem. Once people attached the term communist to our brand new church, the term stuck. Several members resigned their membership because the scrutiny was intense. And even worse, one member lost his job by virtue of his membership in this purported Communist Front organization. But I don't want to make the congregation to be just the victims here either, because communism, that McCarthy thinking, spread broadly. There were also stories that the congregants who didn't like this Reverend Finley urged the leadership of the congregation to consult with the FBI in their efforts to secure his dismissal. Many members deeply resented the references to the FBI to address inter-congregational issues. But nonetheless, the rumors that the church had been investigated by the FBI stuck. In 2001, there was actually a request by this congregation to the Freedom of Information request area asking if we had an FBI file on the congregation or any of its ministers. It will either be a relief or a disappointment to you all to know that there is not. But for the record, it doesn't sit well with a minister to try to get them fired by going to the FBI. So just note that on something, if you've got grievances, come and talk to me directly, and let's keep the FBI out of it, okay? But it has been tried here before. So let's tie all of this together, and let's do it with the realization that there is never one narrative. There are always multiple threads to a story that are happening at any given time that lead to a situation. But the fact is that many outsiders saw our fledgling Unitarian church as a communist front, and it got a lot of pushback because of it. And our members, hundreds of them, continued anyways, persevered anyways, grew anyways. So it makes sense that 2 years after the communist rumors started that the school board asked us to leave the Kenilworth School, and it makes sense that 18 months later we were asked to leave the Valley Garden Center, and that only 3 months later we were asked to leave the YWCA. We were the radicals, the liberals. We were the rabble-rousers, the independent thinkers, the ones who bucked traditional religious thinking. And I will tell you what, we still are. In a discussion about our history with some prospective members, we started discussing that communism and community had the same Latin root, communis. The Latin prefix of com means with or together, and munis means the changes or exchanges that link. Therefore, communist means common, public, shared by many. And these stories are definitely examples of us being linked together in a common way, of us sharing history, a mission, and ultimately sharing a vision for the future. So we are in a time, again, where liberal thinking is being challenged. But instead of picking on the white educated elite and calling them communists, we are picking on those in our society who are most vulnerable. In the 1950s, it was the political right that was driving the character assassinations. Sadly, in this decade, it is the religious right that is doing the harm. They are going after our LGBTQ siblings, putting them through conversion therapy, convincing families that they should be kicked out of their homes and that their very existence is a sin. They are emboldening racists to bring their hatred into the open, standing up for white rights as if white people didn't always have all the rights in this country, and making it a crime to be brown, black, poor, or an immigrant seeking a better life. They are telling us that this country was founded on one faith, their faith, and that all others are not truly American. And in the name of religious freedom, they are allowing discrimination and hate to be written into our laws through the court systems. My dear ones, our history matters. Because those of us who don't pay attention to our history, we are doomed to do it over and over again. The founders of UUCP were resilient. They were so resilient. They so believed in liberal religion that they were willing to move and keep moving and keep moving. And believe me, I know that moving is exhausting. They did that to keep this congregation alive. It would have been so easy to give up, but they didn't. And now here we are in this location. And I know this location is fraught for some of you. The lack of the bus lines, being surrounded by million-dollar homes, the reputation of Paradise Valley. But it was not Paradise Valley when our founders worked so hard to get on this land. It was just a dirt lot at the 4th telephone pole at the end of the dirt road, with a vision of permanence that could carry on from the people who started us in this city. And we are facing difficult times. I don't know if you are weary of everything that's going on in our world, but I am, and it hurts my heart. And this congregation has had difficult times this past year as well, between letting go of some beloved staff members, financial worries, tumult, I've heard you all reference it as. We've gone through challenges. So please remember this. We are resilient. We have overcome adversity before. We have fought systems of oppression, and we have persevered. To use a slogan that in no way should be interpreted as a political endorsement, nevertheless, we persisted. It can be so hard to keep persisting these days. It feels like everything's overwhelming. But let me remind you, we are the people who do not give up. We are the people who look at obstacles and just keep moving. We are the people who believe in liberal religion in the Phoenix community. We are the people that, if you notice through all of those changes, continually provide innovative religious education to our children, all the way through it. We are the ones who will not tolerate our government or our religious institutions or our neighbors telling us what we can or cannot believe. We are the resilient ones. It has been that way here in Phoenix since 1947, for 72 years. May it be so for another 72, 172. Heck, let's make it 572 years more at least. So might it be. Amen.